Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Josh Phillips. Today we are going to discuss Plato's Apology. This is for my CAS 100 class, which is my Introduction to Public Speaking course. So I'm going to do the best I can to run through this rather quickly. Plato's Apology, there's a lot of things on YouTube, on the internet that discuss Plato's Apology. You can take an entire semester just discussing Plato and Socrates, which is what we'll get to here in a second. For my students and for you all who aren't my students watching on YouTube, I would highly recommend first just making sure that you read the materials. You can find a copy of Plato's Apology on the internet anywhere. And I will let you know that Plato's Apology is sometimes referred to as Socrates' Defense. It's the same text. It's somewhere around 20, 30 pages if you find it in a book somewhere. But this is a foundational text for Western education, for the Western canon, for understanding how we have built the humanities just for the last 2,000 years. So this is a foundational text that I think everyone who graduates college, especially if you have a degree in the humanities, but I really think everybody who graduates college should read and understand this foundational text in the Western canon. So usually in my class, we'd get into groups and just think about the following questions. So once you have read it, you should think about some who, what, where, when kind of stuff. So who is the speaker? Why is the speaker on trial? What is the speaker's punishment? How does it relate to the current class we're in? What are some different things we can learn about the education system from this piece, which we'll get to momentarily. And then here's a couple of quotes to react to. So these quotes are well known within the text. So the first is, the unexamined life is not worth living. So what does that mean? And then the second one is, Socrates makes this comment where he says, I appear to be wiser than he because I do not fancy I know what I do not know. So this is a big foundation for Socrates, is just intellectual humility. Couple of things to know here. First, Plato's Apology. Apology is rooted in the Latin term apologia, which means defense. So sometimes people say Plato's Apology is Socrates apologizing the way that we understand saying I'm sorry in the year 2020. No. Apology comes from the root word apologia, which means to defend oneself. And obviously with the evolution of language and words, you can see how we might have sort of started to mess around with the word apology for it to mean defense of oneself to saying I'm sorry. There's a long history there with that term, but words change and words evolve. So it's known as Plato's Apology. Plato is the writer. He's the student of Socrates, which we'll get to on the next slide, I believe. But here's a couple key takeaways from Plato's Apology as far as the foundation. First, it takes place in the city of Athens in Greece. The speaker is Socrates. Socrates is on trial. Plato writes about Socrates' trial here because Socrates didn't write anything down. Plato was Socrates' student, and so everything we know about Socrates comes from the writings of Plato. Well, most of what we know comes from the writings of Plato. Again, the writer is Plato. Socrates is put on trial for corruption and blasphemy of the youth, or excuse me, corruption of the, not blasphemy of the youth, corruption of the youth and blasphemy against the gods. People were saying that he was going around and he was essentially asking the youth, tell me about these gods, right? Tell me about Zeus. Why do you believe in him? Does he really exist? Are all these stories we hear about the gods, are they true or not true? Socrates was going around asking a lot of questions, which then encouraged his students to also ask questions. And anytime the students would ask questions, all of a sudden that starts to crumble the foundations of those in positions of power. Anytime you start questioning these institutions. And so he was charged with corrupting the youth, making it so that the youth were asking questions against these established institutions, right? The priestly class, and also the idea of blasphemy. So blasphemy is saying that saying the gods don't exist, or the gods aren't, all powerful, or maybe I just have questions about the gods. There is a academic debate as to whether or not Socrates himself was an atheist. I personally don't think Socrates had that much of a conviction in anything in his life to say that he was an atheist. I think if anything, Socrates was probably agnostic. So this is to say that, Socrates wasn't firm enough to say, Zeus and the rest of them don't exist, but he just said, you know what, I have a lot of questions about this. This stuff doesn't add up to me, and I'm just going to keep asking questions, as opposed to just accepting fundamentalist dogma because people in positions of power said, X, Y, and Z. So this is what he's charged with. He's going around questioning the gods, and people say you're not allowed to question the gods. You just have to take the understanding of the gods given to you by these powerful figures and just pass those on without any question. He's then put on trial, and this is like a little image I would like you to think about as he's on trial. So he's put on trial in front of the most powerful group of individuals in Athens. So imagine this. Imagine it's the year 2020, you're a US citizen, and you've done something, possibly illegal, or you're being accused of something illegal. In the year 2020, if you're an American citizen, you go to your local courthouse and you sit in front of a panel of 12 of your peers, 12 average citizens, right? And they judge you, right? And just sort of judge and jury, all right? This is not what is happening to Socrates. Imagine this happens instead. Imagine that you are accused of a crime, and instead of going in front of a jury of your peers, you are hauled in front of the United States Congress, all 535 people. So you have 100 people in the Senate, you have 435 people in the House of Representatives. These are the most powerful people in the United States, and they are your judge and jury as to whether or not you are going to be convicted of whatever crime they have doled out against you. That is what Socrates is facing here, right? He's going in front of the most powerful people of his time to defend himself against these charges, all right? So that sort of sets the stage for the trial. I am accused of a crime. I have to go in front of the United States Congress, and I already know that the United States Congress kind of doesn't like me, right? And I also know that the United States Congress would have very good incentive to uphold the institutions, right? So if I'm a guy walking around trying to question these institutions, that's not going to bode well for me for having an impartial jury in the United States Congress if I go around and say, like, hey, I have some questions about these institutions. Maybe these institutions are illegitimate, right? So Socrates knows going in that he's already at a disadvantage. He knows sort of what the outcome of the trial is going to be. He knows he's going to be found guilty. And so he sort of, in a very stubborn Socratic way, says, fine, I'm just going to speak exactly what's on my mind because I know that my verdict is already, determined. And so that's what he decides to do. Let's talk about these three individuals real quick. This you can take an entire semester of this. There's people who have, entire, undergraduate and PhDs degrees on just these three thinkers. So this is a very abbreviated version. So if I leave out lots of details, forgive me. But just so we have a good timeline of what's happening. Socrates is around from 470 to 399 BC. All right, so we're doing the before Christ stuff here, right? Plato is his student. And Plato's around from 428 to 348. And then the student of Plato is Aristotle. So you all, as 18-year-old undergrads, have probably heard these names before. And this just gives you a little bit of a context for how they all kind of relate to each other. They weren't all around at the same time, right? It was a teacher-student relationship, all right? And just for fun, one of the students of Aristotle was a guy named Alexander the Great, all right? So this is kind of how they all work out in a timeline. Now, another sort of very basic timeline that you should understand. Again, I know that all of this history stuff kind of gets, crammed together and we need to separate it out a little bit. It's a little bit difficult to figure, to make a timeline from 400 years ago. But again, just another real basic timeline that you can start with. And again, go take a classics class to get into more details. Is just start with the year zero. All right. So the year zero is pretty significant. Just kind of a lot of things are happening around here. All right. So the year zero, we'll just take it right now as like this is the year Jesus was born. I know there's some dispute, but let's just stay with me, all right? So before the year zero, everybody who was in charge, we're talking about the Greeks, all right? We're talking about Athens. That is the center of Western civilization. We're talking about, there's a lot going on here in Greece at that time. In the year 44 BC, so 44 years before Jesus is born, right? We have another guy with the JC initials named Julius Caesar, so that's easy to remember. So 44 BC, right? Julius Caesar is assassinated and he's Roman. All right, he's in charge of the Roman Senate. After Julius Caesar is assassinated in 44 BC, so again, we're around the year 0, there's a lot of back and forth. There's some wars being fought. Rome turns from a republic into an empire, right? So from a republic form of government where we have some elections and some democracy things going on, and, lots of people are in charge. We spread out power. All of a sudden, Julius Caesar is assassinated and Rome explodes into a empire, which obviously is very different than some sort of representational republic that, might be a little bit more equal. Rome explodes. Right, and now after the year 0, now Rome is in charge, which is in Italy. All right, so if you just remember the year 0, Jesus is born at that time. Obviously, that's important to world history as far as the spread of Christianity and sort of a lot of moral foundations that have been picked up by lots of cultures. Julius Caesar is assassinated near the year 0. The Greeks are in charge before, which is where Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle hung out. The year 0 happens, we have lots of wars, things are shifting, and then after the year 0, Rome in Italy sort of explodes, and then they're kind of in charge of what's going on. All right, so there's a little timeline for you to help kind of put some things in perspective. Socrates makes this distinction between what he calls knowledge and wisdom. So when it comes to knowledge, he gives the jury, if you will, he gives them their due. He says, look, all of you people are very smart, right? If I go in front of the United States Congress, I'm going to be like, look, y'all are very smart. Like, you didn't get here because you're idiots. Like, you know a lot of things. Socrates tells the people who are trying him for corruption and blasphemy, he tells them, like, look, you all are intelligent, knowledgeable, smart people. You are walking dictionaries of information. But he says, but you're not wise. And here's the distinction he makes. Knowledge just means that I have a lot of stats, facts, and definitions in my head, right? I can recite a dictionary and the Encyclopedia Britannica. Like, that's what knowledge is. What Socrates says is wisdom comes with the humility to know that you do not know everything. All right, the humility to step back and say, look, I have made I have rooted my opinions and my values based on what I currently know. But I am open to the idea that new evidence might come into my life that makes me change my mind. And if I'm humble enough, I'll say, look, I spent the last 10 years believing X, but now new evidence is in front of me, so I'm going to change my mind and believe Y. All right? This is what Socrates is trying to distinguish while he's on trial, right? So if you look at antiquity, you think, like, who is a very knowledgeable people? Obviously, the people that he's in front of are knowledgeable, right? Again, these are sort of like the most powerful politicians of the day in Athens. He says, you all are knowledgeable. Today, we can think about knowledgeable people as, doctors and lawyers and people with PhDs teaching in the classroom, and politicians and, CEOs of companies. It's like they have a lot of knowledge, like they know how things work. But Socrates would go around and say, like, are you wise? And that wisdom comes with humility, with hesitancy, with saying, like, you know what? My political beliefs might be wrong. My cultural, my social beliefs might be wrong. So an exercise I like to do with my students in the classroom is I have them write down, and you can do this at home, right? I have them write down just one, right? Cultural, social, or political belief, right? Just one belief that they have that they are very strong in, that they don't think they'll ever change their mind about. So something like, I always vote for the Democrat Party, or I am very pro-life, or, I was confirmed in the Catholic Church, and like Catholicism, that's the correct religion. Like, I just have them write down one thing that they're very firm on, that they will never sway on. And then I ask them to close their eyes. And for like 30 seconds, I ask them to think about, what if I'm wrong? Right? What if I have voted for the Democrat Party for the last, I don't know, like 30 years of my life? My students aren't that old, but, and then I get to, I'm 50 years old and I'm like, maybe I, voted for the wrong party, or I've always been pro-life. And then, maybe one day I'm like, wow, like if I allow new evidence, maybe I'll, switch over and become pro-choice. That's what Socrates is asking people to do. And that is what the jury that he was in front, that's what they refused to do. They said, no, we're in charge. These are our firm beliefs. And if you go around telling people, like, you can question the social or the cultural or the political norms that we put out there, then all of a sudden people see us as fallible, right? So in order for a powerful institution to stand, people have to look up and say, like, this institution is infallible. As soon as Socrates goes in there, starts poking holes and saying, like, maybe you're wrong, maybe you're not that wise, maybe your ideas are incorrect, maybe these gods don't really exist, or maybe they don't exist in the same capacity we thought they did. As soon as you start poking holes in that, people start seeing this institution as a big thing, a big piece of Swiss cheese, and it could crumble, right? So power is predicated on, well, like very strong power is predicated on being infallible. The people in charge always want you to look up at them and say, this person cannot fail. All right. Socrates says, and maybe things are a little bit different. Maybe we should question authority, right? So again, we go back to this idea of wisdom. Socrates says, I know I'm wise because I know that I don't know. And so we have this way of acquiring knowledge. All right. So there's two ways to acquire knowledge. So if you're in a classroom, there's two ways that you can acquire knowledge. The first way is by simply passing on facts. So I'm the teacher, I give you facts, you regurgitate them on the test, you get you have successfully regurgitated them the way in which I have taught them, and then you get an A. And that's the end of the story. Socrates says this isn't very useful because what if the facts that the person that is powerful, right, who is in charge of those facts, what if those facts are incorrect or incomplete, right? What if there's some holes in the facts? So Socrates says there's a different way that we can pass on knowledge. The second way that you could pass on knowledge is that teacher-student relationship. And as I give you information, you and I can rigorously debate facts as they are passed on. So I, as the teacher, can tell you things that I believe are true, right, that I am expert in. And then you as a student can come back with some questions and ask me, the sort of the powerful person in charge in the classroom, if you will, and then force me to defend my position. And then maybe you as a student say, you know what, I took a class with Dr. Phillips, and I think 80% of what he said was pretty good, but there's like 20% that I'm going to continue to refine. And then maybe one day you go and become a professor and you change up a little bit of what you were taught in order to reflect that sort of rigorous back and forth that you had with your previous teachers, right? And the way that we know that this method is better is because we can look back just 100 years, let's say like the 1920s, all right? We can look back into the 1920s and realize that there were world-renowned professors who have since just 100 years ago been proven to give out inaccurate information. These are called superseded scientific theories, which we'll go into in another discussion when we talk about the scientific method. But we know that that's true. So instead of just, I'm powerful, here's the information, regurgitate it for me, don't question it, Socrates says, these people are powerful, they're going to give you knowledge, but they should be willing to debate it, right? And that debate has to be a two-way street. So we have to be willing to let students raise their hand in the classroom and say, I have questions. And if you're a professor and you are shutting down your students who have questions, that's not a good way to be a professor. That's not a Socratic method way of being a professor. How Socrates lived his life, he basically kind of went out into these markets, right? So we think about like farmers markets today, perhaps. But he just went around to like merchants and farmers. He hung around the markets and he just asked people why they did certain things, right? He's basically asking these questions like, can you make a better crop? Can you make a better widget? Do you have a better method for irrigation? Do you have a better way of understanding architecture? Like he would just go around and he's just asking people questions all the time, right? About religion, about politics, about agriculture, about everything, right? Whatever it was that was your profession, Socrates would just come up to you and say, like, why do you do it that way? Tell me more about it. And he would make people articulate why it is they behave in a certain way. And if they can't defend it, Socrates, that's kind of this position Socrates has, was like, well, if you can't defend your own beliefs, you can't defend your own behavior, all of a sudden, if people do that enough, people kind of come to their own conclusion, like, maybe I need to be a little bit more intentional. So imagine the year 2020, let's say that you're Catholic. Socrates would come around and say, like, what is it about Catholicism? Tell me more about it. Like, tell me about all these saints. Tell me about the Eucharist. Tell me about on and on and on and on. And at some point, if you're Catholic and maybe you're just sort of born into the church, at some point, you're going to get around the age 18 of 20. 18 or 20. And if people question you enough, at some point you're going to say, huh, maybe I should go read the Bible like cover to cover. Maybe I should learn a little bit more. Maybe I don't have all the answers. Maybe I don't really know why it is I'm practicing this religion. I've just sort of fallen into it, but I actually haven't like dug into the research on it. So this is what Socrates is getting people to do. All right. Just a quick little illustration of this. Again, this is very, very basic. So all three of these individuals, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, all overlap, and obviously there's lots of other philosophers who are around who add to our understanding of this. But for abbreviated version, Socrates made it so that we can inquire about things. So he sort of helps mold the education system, right? Instead of teacher-student regurgitating facts, it's like debate facts, ask questions. Plato comes around. Plato has a lot to say about politics. Aristotle does as well. But Aristotle's big contribution is he gets into things like logic, the rhetoric, the scientific method. He starts to put these things in order for us, right? So these three individuals are just sort of giving us the educational structure, the political structure, and the scientific method structure that we need in order to ask the right questions, in order to move progress forward. So an example of what this might look like, right? In the year 1900 as opposed to the year 399 BC. Imagine that. Let's go back to 399 BC and let's imagine that you're an aerospace engineer, which obviously you're not in 399. However, if I'm a teacher and I'm teaching people how to build airplanes in 399 BC, you would say like Josh is the secretary of airplanes, right, for this big governmental institution, and only he is allowed to, only his blueprints are allowed to be produced, right? And so I make blueprints for an airplane. I give them to my student. My student has to reproduce the exact same airplane, right? And then my student's in charge. I've passed away, right? And then the next student has to produce the exact same blueprints for airplanes. So there's one guy who's given all the power to say like, your blueprints for airplanes are the creme de la creme. They are the pinnacle of airplane blueprints, and no one is allowed to deviate from those plans. The problem with this, obviously, is that over the course of hundreds of years, if we use the same plans for airplanes, we're never allowed to make progress. We're never allowed to, ask questions. This is different than the Socratic method. Socratic method says, hey, Josh, you're a pretty smart guy on airplane building at the moment, but you're going to have a lot of students, and those students are going to come in and they're going to look at your airplane blueprints and they're going to say, you know what? We should use a different material. You know what? Like, there's a different angle that we should put on the wings to create more lift. There's different variables as far as airspeed, et cetera, that we should think about. So if I am engaged in the the Socratic method, then I allow my students into my classroom and I allow my students to look at my airplane designs and rip them to shreds and ask a lot of questions about whether or not my genius of airplane building is actually genius, or if there is a way to build, right? Can you build a better airplane? All right. When you have these tools in place, you have the right politics, right, where people are allowed to sort of freely do whatever they want. If they have prestige, right, are they, the secretary of airplanes, in Washington, D.C., where they're allowed to engage with use of the scientific method, where they can engage with the Socratic method, where they can question people in positions of power, you start to have accelerated progress, right? Because now people don't need all these fancy degrees in order to bring forth the best idea. So this is something that is absolutely mind-blowing to me, and it should be mind-blowing to you no matter who you are. All right. The year 1903, the Wright brothers over here, they set forth they get the first airplane into the air, right? And it's like a 10-second, like, it's very, very quick. It's toothpicks held together with spit and glue, right? But they make it work. In 1903, we have the first flight at Kitty Hawk. The Wright brothers didn't even graduate high school. Like, the Wright brothers were just a couple of guys living out on the prairie, just really interested in airplanes, right? There was no like official Athens document or Washington, D.C. document that said you are allowed to build airplanes and you're the only ones, right? The United States politics said just, go out, live on the prairie. If you want to try to build an airplane, fine. We don't care if you have an advanced degree or not, right? So they were able to ask questions. Now, with the Socratic method, they take their blueprints for the 1903 airplane. Somebody else gets a hold of them, gets a hold of those blueprints, and they start to tweak it a little bit. And they're like, have you thought of this material? Have you thought of that? Can we build a better airplane? By the time, the late 19 teens come around, right, and then into the 1940s, I mean, we have these giant aircraft that we're using for World War I and World War II, right? And then by the time we get to 1969, so in the short span of 66 years, we go from the very first airplane, which again, it's toothpicks with spit and glue here, right, to putting a man on the moon, right, to building rockets to fly in 66 years. Right, so I always like to think, like, what would it have been like to be born in, like, I don't know, 1890, right? If you're born in 1890, when you're 13, you're like, hey, I think we finally got off the ground. We've been trying to solve this airplane problem since forever, right? 1890, on your 13th birthday, you see people fly or you hear about people flying for the first time. And then by 1869, so, you're into your 80s now, but you might still be alive, right? You watch on TV Neil Armstrong step on the moon, right? And that's all possible when you create an environment that says, question those experts, right? Allow facts to be rigorously debated. Allow innovative students, right? The youth, allow them to ask questions of people with PhDs who have been in their profession for 30, 40, 50 years, right? Create that kind of environment where people don't have to dogmatically accept the rules of authority or the lessons of authority, and allow them to play around with it, and all of a sudden you can have accelerated success, right? So people in positions of power have to be humble enough to say, other people might have a better way of doing this, right? And young people have to be encouraged to ask a lot of questions. Okay, we're almost done here. This one of my probably the most well-known quote is, "The unexamined life is not worth living," which Socrates says. And essentially what he's saying here is right here, right? He says, "I'd rather die than be told how to live or how to think." And so they give him a choice to say, you can either die, and this is a picture of him about to drink hemlock. He's like, you can either die or you can go live in exile. So you can go live out in the middle of nowhere and don't have any contact with anybody ever again, because we know how powerful you are. And Socrates says, the unexamined life is not worth living. I would rather sit here and drink hemlock than be exiled out into the wilderness and never be allowed to question and explore life, right? That's too important to him. Which I love this, right? It's pretty much the theme of the Hunger Games and every other sort of dystopian thing that we've thought about or written about. And people have written about, forever, right? So this idea where, if you think about like the Hunger Games, it's like we would rather, have the freedom to starve or to fail, as opposed to just having the government like ship in goods every couple of weeks, right? We would we want to explore. We want to have an abundance life. Like we don't just want, for a lack of a better term, we don't just want like welfare sending us a check every month and us like sitting in front of the TV, eating food just barely enough to survive, and then just getting a check the next month, right? Socrates is like, I don't want that. Like, give me the freedom to go out there and explore things on my own. I don't want to just go live in exile in this boring existence. I love this painting because of how much sadness and shame are around here, right? But Socrates is just very, very defiant. He's like, look, like I'm totally strong and committed to my beliefs, and I understand that there's all this like pain and shame and guilt and confusion. He's the one who's about to die, but he's sort of like just defiant and strong in his beliefs till the end. With this, there have been people, and you can go watch other YouTube clips or research this. There's been plenty of scholars who have done the obvious comparison between the life of Socrates and the life of Jesus, right? So they're both these figures from from 2000 to a little over 2000 years ago. So people have sort of said, and they both have a similar life, right? Both of them are these sort of fringe figures who have very strong critiques of authority and power systems, and at the end of it, those powerful systems eventually sentence them to death, right? So Socrates has a choice of exile, basically, that they say, execution if you don't leave. So he drinks hemlock. Jesus is speaking out against religious individuals at the time, the powerful state, all that kind of the Roman Empire, and then eventually he's executed for that, right? So both of these individuals, Socrates and Jesus, live these very similar type of lives with regard to speaking out against authority, and then they were both used as sort of pillars of Western civilization. Now, people get a little bit perturbed about this because they say, well, I'm not Christian, or I don't like the teachings of Socrates. What I tell students is, like, I don't care if you like these individuals, and I don't care if you disagree with Christianity. That doesn't change the fact that they were both still pillar-like sort of founding individuals of the way in which Western civilization was shaped. So the world you live in is shaped by these two people, even if you don't like them, right? Socrates, it's been said, has sort of given us our philosophical foundation as far as like the education system, right? Asking questions of Socratic method. He gives us the pillar of that. And then Jesus has given Western civilization sort of this moral foundation as far as the ways in which we structure values and systems and moral behavior in Western culture over the last 2,000 years. Again, the religious question, your personal religious preference aside, it's hard to argue that, Christianity isn't somehow foundational in this whole Western civilization experiment we got going on. All right. So these two individuals are pillar individuals in Western Civ. There you have it. And they both have sort of similar relationships with the powerful state at the time. Final slide. Just a question on the Socratic method. So the Socratic method is a form of acquiring knowledge through asking and answering questions. And one thing I stress to my students is it must be a two-way dialogue. So again, I can't sit in a classroom and just lecture students all the time. Like, at some point, if I have a classroom of 20, 30 students, like, some of you all need to raise your hand and challenge me. Some of you all need to raise your hand and ask questions if things are unclear. And I, as the professor, it's my job to defend whatever it is I'm teaching. So if you have questions about, whatever, just raise your hand and ask those questions. And it's also, important that if you disagree with me, right, with something I'm presenting, like, you raise your hand and challenge me, right? Again, it's on me to defend my position. It's not on you just to accept whatever it is I'm teaching, right? It's on me to say, hey, this is what's going on in, the field of communication, whatever we're teaching that day. And it's on me to defend and answer your questions. So if you ever have a teacher who says, you can't ask that question is out of bounds, that is not a good educational environment, all right? Teachers put stuff out, and if you have questions, right, and it doesn't mean that you're correct, right? Just because you raise your hand and say, like, I disagree with you, teacher, it doesn't mean you're correct, right? It just means that it's always on the person making the claims to defend himself or herself when someone raises their hand and says, you know what, I have a lot of questions, or I disagree with you, or can you clarify this for me, all right? Socrates allows you to be in the classroom today in the manner in which you're in the classroom, and that just means in a classroom where, again, you're allowed to raise your hand and question authority. And again, this doesn't mean that you're correct and that the teacher is incorrect. It just means that you should be allowed to ask questions and ask them robustly. And again, it has to be a two-way street. So I can't sit there and lecture the whole time. If you have questions, raise your hand. If you want to challenge me, I am more than happy to enter into a debate, enter into a dialogue with you to sort of figure out these difficult problems, specifically ones that take place in the humanities. We can have that conversation all day. All right. So that's what I encourage you to do. I encourage you to sort of push that envelope in your other classrooms, and just always look for those teachers who are willing to engage in dialogue, as opposed to ones who sort of firmly put their hand down and say, this is correct, you must believe this. That is no way to educate someone. All right. I want to have a conversation with my students in a way where, when we're done having a conversation, both of us have sort of worked through the hard conversation in order to get to solve the problem. If I just say, it's my way or the highway, that stops conversation, and then the students don't really know why it is that they're supposed to believe or think what it is I'm teaching, right? If I just say, like, this is the correct answer, that stops thinking. But if I say, here's what the answer is, and then we debate that answer for an hour, now all of a sudden we've sort of gotten everything out. And now people have a better understanding as to how we got to that conclusion, as opposed to just saying, like, this is the conclusion, full stop. All right. Socratic method, two-way dialogue, engage with your professors, engage with the education system. Okay, that's all I have for Plato's Apology. I know there's a lot of holes in it, but again, you can take an entire semester on this stuff. But this kind of gets us a good foundation. If you want to keep going down this rabbit hole of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, please do. But hopefully this was a good little introduction for you. Okay. See you later.